Chapter 18 Crisis of Comrades. Year 0002, May 22nd. Zack twiddled his thumbs and tried to pretend he didn't have a good guess as to why he and Cloud were in Shinra's shiny glass elevator, and the numbers were slowly counting up. Or was it down? To the 66th floor. He had a guess, but that didn't mean he was right. Cloud was probably going to wring his neck either way, and maybe Zack should have prepared him. Maybe he still had time to. On impulse, he reached out and jabbed the stop button. There was a soft noise behind him, and Zack turned to see Cloud had leaned back into the glass wall, arms crossed across his chest. He raised one eyebrow expectantly at Zack and said, "Well?" Zack moved closer to the glass wall and stared out over the Midgar cityscape. It was bordering on evening, the long fingers of fading daylight stretching underneath the cloud cover and burnishing the city into varied warm colors. He pressed his hand against the glass. "So," he said, drawing the word out carefully. He tilted his head just enough to get a good look at Cloud's face. "You know how Lazard's gone missing?" As promised, he had explained the situation to Cloud once they'd gotten back to Midgar. Zack was still irritated that Yuffie had managed to make off with one of his materia. He may have gotten it back just this morning, attached to a postcard from the little monkey, with the note that he could have it back. "I don't know how to use this junk." Yuffie's little stunt had gotten a smile out of Cloud at least, which was more reaction than he'd had about Lazard. Zack wasn't too surprised about that. Cloud hadn't known Lazard. All Cloud had given him was a blank stare and a what-can-you-do shrug. Clearing his throat, Zack continued, "I may have left something out." Cloud met Zack's sheepish expression blandly. "Is that so?" he replied dryly. He didn't even do Zack the favor of making it a question. Swallowing, Zack got it over with fast. "Sephiroth told me he found papers. Promotion papers. Lazard was getting ready to induct you into Soldier." Cloud stiffened, frown immediately forming on his face at the news. "I never heard anything about it." Zack winced. He knew Cloud's moods well enough by now to recognize a sign that they might go sour. He felt bad about all of it, both for what he was about to tell him, as well as the fact that it was happening now. "Lazard and I talked about it, actually, several months ago." He looked upward, unable to meet Cloud's steady gaze as he made that confession. "I told him I advised against bringing you into Soldier because you didn't have enough emotional control and were prone to mood swings. That until you could prove yourself stable enough for such a commanding position, I didn't think it was a good idea." "Thanks for that." Zack laughed. "Lazard agreed with me, actually, based on my report about the incident with the Turks." He looked at Cloud again, taking in his surly but self-satisfied expression. In a rush, he went on. "Point is, he was probably going to talk to me about it again, or had just decided you'd been doing well enough to go forward with it. And then he disappeared, and Sephiroth ripped the papers up." Cloud looked thoughtful at that. "Why would he—" Zack snorted incredulous. "You kidding? Sephiroth's been actively working to keep you out of Soldier since we brought you back." He still couldn't fathom why Sephiroth was being so helpful with things, or what his motives were, but he was willing to take his goodwill as far as it would go. It helped them keep their cover anyway. "Ah," Cloud said, his expression lightening, as if Zack had cleared something up for him. Zack was glad someone understood. It seemed to him as if his entire life, from the point when Angeal and Genesis had deserted onward, could be described in a singular word. And that word was, "What?" Cloud didn't answer for a few moments, taking the time to study a gloved hand and pointedly not looking at Zack. "I think he likes a puzzle, a challenge." Zack made a noise to show he was following so far. He is also selfish, and he doesn't like others interfering. Unless he shoves them into it himself, Zack muttered, though it was with good humour. He and Sephiroth were past that, for which he was glad. He likes to be in control, Cloud said with a slight shrug, glancing at Zack before going back to studying his gloves. He'll undercut other people's power to give him an edge, even if he doesn't believe he needs it necessarily.
Huh, Zack said. Makes sense, I guess.
He'd never really thought about it that way, but then again, he wasn't exactly the closest person to Sephiroth. He liked to think they were better friends now, but he still barely saw the guy. Sephiroth remained an enigma, flitting in and out of Zack's presence at will. He was still as distant and hard to reach as ever. Maybe even more so. Had he been this bad before Zack had brought back word of his failure in Mediaheim? It didn't seem like it. Now, with Cloud and Zack's own secrets, it was hard not to keep his own distance, as the possibilities came to him. It was hard to look a guy in the eyes, knowing you might have to kill him. It was harder still when it was a friend of yours, and that was a feeling that Zack knew intimately. If they didn't save Sephiroth, he'd have one more friend's blood on his hands, right there alongside Angeal's, Asai's, and Sebastian's. Zack leaned in closer to the glass, his breath fogging the surface, and willed the dark thoughts from his mind.
Sephiroth being a weird control freak aside, what I'm saying is, now that Lazard's gone and Heidegger's taking control of Soldier, no one's going to listen to me if I say you're not suitable for the program.
So right now, Cloud asked unhappily, ducking his chin behind his scarf.
Heidegger wants a word with us, yeah.
Zack pushed away from the glass and turned towards Cloud to grip his shoulder, between the guard and neck. He gave a slight squeeze.
I have no idea how this is going to go, but now you can't say I didn't warn you.
Cloud let out a sharp breath, his face smoothing except for a wrinkle between his eyes, indicating his feelings on the matter. Zack didn't need to be an expert on his friend's expressions to see that he wasn't happy right now. Reaching up, Cloud pried Zack's hand off his shoulder and gave it a squeeze back in what Zack assumed was thanks. It was hard to tell sometimes, though at least it wasn't the shrug-off he'd been fearing. Stepping forward, Cloud didn't respond to Zack's words, but punched the elevator button to get them moving again. Zack sucked in a breath and let it out again. Time to face the music then. Lifting his eyes, he watched the numbers until their floor was up and the car came to a smooth halt. The doors hushed open, and he hesitated for a few seconds before shoving Cloud out ahead of him. Cloud's stifled curse made him crack a grin, and Zack thumped him on the back.
Ready, buddy?
The glare he received for his joviality was answer enough, and Cloud stalked off down the hall ahead of him. All he needed was a long coat like Sephiroth's to snap around his legs ominously, and Cloud would be set. Smothering a chuckle at the image, Zack hurried forward to take the lead again. Before he knew it, his boots went from sleek tile to plush red carpet of the boardroom. Heidegger was waiting for them, seated in the chair at the end of the long table. Zack stopped about a foot away and immediately snapped to attention.
Sir!
Heidegger's gaze only landed on Zack briefly before moving to rest on Cloud. Zack kept his focus slightly upward and straight ahead and fought down the urge to check on his friend.
Well, if it isn't our little prodigy and his mentor,
Heidegger said with a chortle, banging one hand against the tabletop. Zack immediately missed Lazard's quieter nature. Lazard may not have been everything he thought he was, what Zack had believed him to be, but at least he was someone Zack had wanted to follow. He had been someone who had won Zack's respect, because he'd respected all of them in turn. The silence stretched, and Zack was vaguely aware that Heidegger was waiting for a response from Cloud. He shuffled and shifted in his seat, wide, political smile growing tight as the seconds passed. It was kind of amusing to watch, Zack reflected. Maybe that was why Cloud did it. He'd stopped really noticing those long pauses. Finally, Heidegger cleared his throat noisily.
Yes, well.
Another long pause ensued, and finally Zack couldn't take it, so he broke it.
Sorry if we're running late, sir. There was a problem with the elevator.
Heidegger seemed to seize on the excuse to give Zack a narrow-eyed stare.
Just don't do it again. I expect promptness.
Zack saluted again. It seemed to keep Heidegger happy at least.
Sir, yes, sir.
Heidegger looked satisfied with that, and turned his attention back to Cloud.
I suppose you're wondering why you're here.
Sir, came Cloud's quiet response. Again, it wasn't a question, and Zack wondered if he was trying to antagonize Heidegger. He hoped this wasn't going to turn into another incident. Sitting back in his chair, which squeaked in protest to the shifting weight, Heidegger continued.
We've had our eye on you since your unfortunate accident. We're offering you a chance of a lifetime. The President wants you to join the ranks of our first-class soldiers.
Not interested. The response was flat and final. Even Zack couldn't stop himself from rounding on Cloud in surprise.
What?
Heidegger barked, rocking forward in his chair. Not interested, sir. Zack stared, torn between hysterical amusement and a sort of mute horror. He'd known Cloud didn't want the position and would likely refuse, but this? Zack took a moment to wish he'd packed his bags in case they needed to get out of Midgar suddenly. Heidegger gaped, then said,
Come again?
Cloud looked briefly at Zack. Zack was in no frame of mind to decipher his expression, before he let his gaze slip back to Heidegger. I don't want to be a soldier first class, sir. I'm not even in the program.
Poppycock! Heidegger roared. You're already performing soldier duties.
His palm slapped down on the tabletop again to accentuate his point. No, sir. I only go on soldier missions when they are assigned to Zack, and he performs the duties. Which was patently a complete and utter lie, but Zack wasn't going to say that. Half the time he just sat back and let Cloud go for it. Maybe it was slacking, but it was kind of fun to watch. He helped at least half the time. Heidegger turned towards Zack, mouth twitching.
Is this true?
Yes, sir, Zack said immediately. The lie left his mouth like it was nothing.
I let him have a go at a few of the weaker monsters, but they're my missions and my duty. I wouldn't shirk them.
Heidegger blustered for a minute, face red in frustration.
But he's gone head-to-head with Sephiroth! I don't know anything about that, sir, Zack said. I was on duty up north.
Turning to Cloud, Heidegger pointed a finger at him accusingly.
You did! There are eyewitnesses!
Cloud tilted his chin up. Narrow eyes, the only indication of his bad mood. I don't know what Sephiroth's aim was, sir. We exchanged only a few rounds before he broke it off. I doubt I left much of an impression on him. How Cloud could manage to say that with a straight face was a trick Zack wished he could learn.
And what about the missions against Avalanche? I was told you performed at soldier level.
I got desperate, Cloud answered flatly. Zack and Sephiroth were not around, and the men were in danger of dying. I don't remember much of what happened. Zack was starting to worry that Heidegger was either going to go up like a bomb or burst a blood vessel. He could only watch in fascination as Heidegger spluttered, clearly beside himself, and banged his fists on the table repeatedly. Finally, he managed to say through gritted teeth,
This is a direct order from President Shinra himself.
I decline, Cloud responded immediately. Heidegger opened and closed his mouth wordlessly for several seconds, then ground out,
I will inform the President of your decision.
He narrowed his eyes at both of them. lifting one hand and pointing at Cloud.
You don't understand the opportunity you're turning down.
Cloud didn't respond, choosing to stare straight ahead while remaining at attention. That seemed to be the final straw for Heidegger.
Get out!
He roared, jabbing a finger at the door. Zack saluted sharply, turned on his heel, and headed for the door. He could hear Cloud's footsteps following him closely. The tension in Zack's shoulders didn't abate until they were in the elevator once more, and he could slump against the glass wall. He inhaled deeply, held it for a few heartbeats, then let it out again.
That was something.
Cloud didn't move from his position in front of the doors, and gave a short, unhappy shrug at Zack's words. It probably would have gone worse if you hadn't warned me. Which was Cloud speak for thanks. Zack grinned at him and innocently said, I know. Waving a hand in acknowledgement of the jab, Cloud continued. They framed Avalanche in my time, and had the plate dropped on Sector 7.
Yeah,
Zack said, trying very hard not to think about someone dropping a section of the plate on anyone.
We need to talk about that.
Avalanche was definitely something he needed to address with Cloud. He'd been avoiding the issue for a while now, half because he'd forgotten, and half because he just hadn't wanted to after what had happened to Asai and Sebastian. The wound of losing those two friends had been far too raw at the time. He hoped it hadn't been a mistake to put it off this long, but he trusted Cloud, if nothing else. He'd ask him about it later today, while it was still on his mind. Shifting from foot to foot, Cloud's expression turned mildly guilty as he looked over Zack's shoulder. It's not just that. I know he's not the same one who did it, but I wouldn't have accepted from Lazard either. Zack nodded, but before he could say anything, the elevator dinged as they reached the ground floor. Cloud stepped out first, Zack just behind him, and they crossed the tiled floor in easy strides.
Hey, how's my favorite boys doing?
Lila called brightly from behind the counter, waving vigorously at them as they passed.
Still kicking,
Zack replied, as behind him Cloud raised a hand in greeting as well. Lila laughed, waving after them as they made their way to the front doors. Just as they stepped out into Midgard's streets, Zack's phone beeped. Pulling it out, he found a new message from Kunzel.
Hold on a sec, Cloud.
Cloud stopped a few feet away, and Zack focused back on his phone. It was simple, nothing like Kunzel's usual information-filled messages. He was often verbose in them, even when he was just sending Zack something about his day. All it said was, "Are you busy?" Zack tapped out a response.
Just going to meet Luxair for sword practice. What's wrong?
The response was nearly immediate.
I need to talk to you about something. Bring your shadow. That was ominous. Zack fired back with, All right, you can join us on the training fields. We can talk after. Kunzel's coming to sword practice,
Zack said out loud. What's wrong? Cloud asked, frowning at Zack's phone. Zack shrugged and started walking again, though he couldn't quite clear the troubled expression from his face. Idly, he flipped his phone back and forth between his hands.
No idea. He said he wanted to talk with us, though.
Cloud gave a quiet hum at that, but said nothing further. Coming to an abrupt stop once more, Zack rounded on him.
What we talked about the other day, do you still want to go through with it?
Cloud's expression went pensive. I do. A lot went unsaid, but that was Cloud for you. Zack didn't need to question it further.
So, depending on what he wants to talk with us about,
Zack said with a sharp nod. Cloud grinned. He could just want to ask about your last mission, sir. Returning the grin, Zack threw a sloppy, mocking salute, and even added a click of his heels to the gesture.
Yeah, I mean, everyone wants to hear about us playing whack-a-mole with an entire colony of trick plays.
Cloud gave him a mirthful look, shaking with quiet laughter. With a mock-affronted huff, Zack pocketed his phone and tossed his arm around Cloud's shoulder. making the laughter cut off with an abrupt choking sound.
At least we were able to put Heidegger off for now.
He wasn't fooled in thinking that they'd be able to put it off forever. Eventually, they'd managed to corral Cloud into accepting a place in Soldier.
Maybe we'll get out of here before then, who knows?
Cloud leaned into Zack's side for a beat, before pulling away. At least it was better than his complete avoidance of late. Still, Zack frowned, then reached out and cuffed him upside the back of the head for good measure. Cloud gave him a wide-eyed look of confusion and brought one hand up to rub the injury. Zack laughed.
You have the biggest eyes I've ever seen on anyone.
If anything, that caused Cloud's eyes to get even bigger, and he flushed redder than a bomb about to explode, before ducking as far into his scarf as was physically possible.
Zack!
It came out strangled and caused Zack to laugh again. Zack reached out and tugged the scarf down away from his face.
What? They're pretty. Maybe even prettier than mine.
But not as pretty as Aerith's, Cloud managed, batting Zack's hand away so he could pull the scarf back up. He was still beet red and avoiding even looking in Zack's direction. Reaching out, Zack gave Cloud's shoulder a little shove and started walking again.
Aerith's eyes aren't pretty. They're gorgeous. Get it right, come on.
Moron, Cloud said in an undertone Zack was quite sure he was supposed to hear. Zack swung his arms up and clasped them at the back of his head as he turned down the street towards the soldier compound.
Hey, I got the girl in the end.
How's that possible?
She says I'm sweet.
Zack lifted his hand to wave at the third in the guard booth as he opened the gates for them. Cloud kicked at the road, sending a rock skittering ahead of them. More like a sap, he retorted.
Sweet sap,
Zack fired back. A sticky mess, then. The blush that had been fading from Cloud's pale cheeks came back full force, though Zack wasn't quite sure why. With a metaphorical shrug, Zack grinned wildly and slung his arm back around Cloud's shoulders.
Nah, we haven't done that sort of thing yet.
Cloud appeared to be rendered speechless, so Zack chalked it up as a win for him. He steered them back towards the training fields, where he could see Luxier and a few other thirds and seconds loitering. Raising his hand, he waved jovially at the group and got a mix of greetings in response. He spotted Kunzel lounging on a bench a short distance off. Zack released Cloud and rubbed his hands together.
All right, who needs help with what?
Free from Zack's clutches, Cloud stumbled over to slump on the bench next to Kunzel, looking ruffled. Kunzel didn't even look up from his phone. Luxier's hand shot into the air.
Can you teach me that thing you do with your sword? You know, the twirly thing. What, this?
Zack asked, pulling the buster sword off his back. He lifted the sword in one hand and gave it a neat spin, the hilt sliding between his fingers with practiced ease before setting it back into place on his back.
Yeah, Luxier cheered. That!
Wading in amongst the group, Zack said,
That's called stylistic flair. Come up with your own.
Luxier followed him as Zack came to a stop beside a familiar third.
Aw, come on, Zack. It looks so amazing.
Laughing, Zack gave Luxier's shoulder a pat.
No way.
Hey, boss, the third said. Zack looked him up and down, taking note of his stronger stance. He squared his shoulders and kept his head up, not like the downtrodden guy Zack had met ages ago in the briefing room, who'd been about ready to give up and go home.
How was your last mission, Russell?
Zack asked. A grin cracked Russell's face.
Good. I think if I keep it up, I might actually get promoted to second class soon. Good for you. Keep chasing that dream, all right?
Zack said, jostling Russell's shoulder and grinning at the wide, pleased smile he got in return. This was why he'd let so many of his fellow soldiers join this little shindig. Not only did he get to make more friends among the ranks, but it gave him a chance to spread the words that meant so much to him. Angiel had done this sort of thing for him, and now Zack could do it for other people. He could do it for Luxier, Russell, for the other thirds and seconds who had sought him out for whatever reason. He could even do it for Cloud.
Right, boss, I will. Hey, you know what?
Zack turned and grabbed Luxier, pulling him forward.
Why don't you and Luxier have a go? Then you can see how you measure up.
Russell looked nervous, but set his mouth into a firm line.
Yeah, I can do it. If I win, can I have a go with you, Zack?
Luxier asked as Russell turned to scope out the fields once more. Zack gave them both a shove to get them moving.
Maybe, who knows? Show me what you've got.
It was weird having so many people descend on him, looking for tips, asking about his sword form. Zack was used to being the life of the party. He'd always gotten on well with other soldiers, other people, but lately it had been different. More and more soldiers had been showing up to these little meetings, or drifting over from their own training and sparring to talk to him. Like now, as he watched Luxier and Russell square off, only to hear his name being called behind him. Zack glanced back over his shoulder as a cluster of thirds descended on him. The seconds hung back, a few gesticulating, as they argued about the best way to dispatch a jewel horn.
Hey Zack, I was thinking of investing in some new materia since I got a raise. What do you think suits me best, blizzard or thunder?
One of the thirds asked. Zack scuffed a hand through his hair. It was these sort of questions that were new, coming to him for advice, asking him what he thought, like it mattered. He remembered how other soldiers would seek Angiel out like this, and Zack wasn't too certain how he felt that they were doing it to him now. At least Angiel had a clue what he was doing.
Well...
He tried to imagine what Angiel would say, but Angiel had never been huge on materia. While Zack utilized it to spare Buster Sword, Angiel had been more of a brawler when he wasn't using a sword.
You know, Cloud's really great with materia. Why don't we...
Zack leaned to the side to see where Cloud was, and spotted him sitting on the bench with Kunzel.
Hey, Cloud, come here, would you?
Cloud looked up from his conversation with Kunzel, before standing up and wandering over to join them. Zack waved at the third in question and said,
He's thinking about getting himself new materia. What do you think's better, blizzard or thunder?
Cloud shifted his weight onto one leg, crossing his arms as he regarded the third. After a moment he said, Blizzard is more controlled. A solid attack, versatile. You can create places to stand or block your enemy's path, but it is easily countered with enough heat. So you have to pay attention to your terrain, and to if your enemy has fire magic or materia to counter you. It can also act as a second weapon, as you can pierce or slash enemies if you can predict their movements. Even if a monster is immune to cold, a bleeding wound will slow it down, or even dissuade it from attacking further. Thunder is less controlled, easier to branch out and hit multiple enemies from a distance. It can also stun your enemy, if powerful enough. Against someone who carries a metal weapon, it's pretty invaluable, as you both injure and disarm an opponent. But you have to be careful not to hit yourself, to be able to control it, because it will fight to take the shortest path to the ground. That also makes the direction the attack comes from predictable, unless you have enough control over the materia to make a horizontal attack. Basically, it comes down to how well you control materia, and if you prefer up-close fighting or fighting at a distance. Cloud blinked into the silence that followed his words, sending a questioning glance at Zack. Zack shrugged.
And this is why I called him over. Me? I just put some power into it and go.
As the third gave a thoughtful sound, another asked,
So what do you suggest for someone who likes to do a bit of brawling?
Zack glanced away for a second to check out how Russell was doing against Luxier. The third was holding his own fairly well, a little more heavily built than Luxier, and had an advantage in raw power, but he was definitely less skilled and a bit slower.
Luxier! Zack called. Watch that opening in the overhand swing. Russell, you're leaving your left side wide open.
Support materia or independent, Cloud said in response to the third. Most people pass it up for the elemental materia because those are easy to use and they can see the results. But if you can learn to use the boost on yourself and the detractors on your enemy, the combination is significantly more powerful than any of the individual spells alone.
What's your favorite sword-based support materia? Exploder Blade for sure,
Zack said.
Nothing like being able to surprise your enemy with a sudden explosion. It's a bit difficult to use since it's such a wild card, but it's got so many uses. What about you, Cloud?
A different voice called from a small crowd around them.
And do you think it's worth it to try and get your hands on a scan?
I've used Fireblade, but I haven't really seen many of the other ones, Cloud responded with a frown. Scan, though. If you're inexperienced in fighting a wide variety of enemies, it's good to have one in your inventory. The better traveled you become, the less you'll need it. But it never hurts to have a reminder. Sometimes the key to a battle is quickly knowing your enemy's weaknesses, and Scan can give you the advantage. As Cloud talked, Zack ducked out of the group. The circle immediately closed behind him as more questions poured in. At least he wouldn't be missed. As he trotted over towards Luxier and Russell, Zack pulled Buster Sword off his back.
Let's see if you guys can give me a workout.
Cloud sagged back onto the bench bonelessly as the last of the seconds and thirds left the field. His throat felt dry and sore as the questions about materia hadn't stopped once for the hours they'd been out here. He had set them on each other out of self-defense, his voice hoarse from so much unaccustomed talking. Even then, there had always been at least one soldier at his elbow, asking what materia Cloud thought was best for him. As if Cloud knew them well enough to advise. But he'd done his best. Zack wandered up to flop down beside him, looking sweaty but pleased with himself. At least he'd gotten a workout. Cloud was used to being dragged off by Gibbs or one of the others. Still, it had seemed kind of fun. He'd spent months studying materia on top of using them extensively, partially because it interested him, and partially during his search to find a cure for the geostigma. Having Yuffie as a friend was always a great resource for obscure knowledge and unique interpretations on the use of materia. A bottle suddenly appeared, held down in front of Cloud's face. The water in it sloshed as it was jiggled back and forth, a second one dangling before Zack.
Thought you two needed this,
Kunzel said from behind them. Zack snatched his without a word and chugged a good half of it before upending the rest over his head. Cloud took his with a nod of thanks, drinking it at a more restrained pace that didn't send droplets of it flying everywhere, like Zack had. It was dark enough that the training fields were cast mostly in shadow. A nearby light spilled illumination in their immediate vicinity. Cloud wouldn't be surprised if Kunzel had taken care of that as well.
I had to field off so many invitations to go drinking,
Zack said.
You better appreciate that. I might have been able to get a free meal too. Your sacrifice will go down in history,
Kunzel said dryly. Cloud frowned when Zack grabbed the half-finished water bottle out of his hand, but didn't protest as Zack took a long swig from it. It had already done the job of soothing his sore throat, after all. Kunzel chose that moment to continue.
Did you know that the Turks are investigating Cloud and think you're planning some sort of anti-Shin reaction?
Zack choked on his mouthful of water, spitting most of it out and coughing harshly to clear his lungs. Cloud didn't blame him, staring up at Kunzel, who regarded him blandly. He certainly hadn't expected Kunzel to open with something so direct, let alone with information like that. He glanced over at Zack, who was still spluttering. No help there. Well, they had wanted an opportunity.
Yes.
He said simply.
Yes you know, or yes you are?
Kunzel asked, idly shoving his hands into his pockets as he walked around the bench.
I've been doing a little watching and looking since I heard about this, and I'm still not sure what it is I'm looking at.
Cloud leaned back, regarding Kunzel quietly. Beside him, Zack had finally recovered himself, but didn't immediately jump in. He supposed that meant Zack was letting him decide how to go about it.
I don't like Shinra.
But there are more important things at stake, he said. A possible future they wanted to prevent, and the man they had to save to see that happen.
Well, that answers one question. You're the ringleader, aren't you?
Kunzel murmured, tilting his head to regard Cloud.
How am I a ringleader?
Cloud muttered under his breath, half to himself.
We don't usually have a ring to lead,
Zack added. Kunzel gave them both an assessing look.
So, just the two of you then? That's probably the only reason I don't know more, come to think of it. Probably,
Zack said cheerfully.
It's been nice being a step ahead of you for once.
Giving an acknowledging nod to the Jap, Kunzel looked back to Cloud.
If Zack's in this, I'm your man. So what's at stake? Kunzel,
Zack said, looking touched.
I've been your friend since you arrived at Shinra, Zack. You're not getting rid of me just because you have a new best friend. Thanks, man. Really.
Zack looked down at his hands, expression sobering. He tightened his grip on the water bottle he still clutched until the plastic creaked.
What's at stake? I guess you could say we all are. Shinra's rotten.
He blew out a heavy breath and smiled wryly.
We're trying to make sure Sephiroth doesn't go the way of Genesis. But at the same time, we're trying to escape Shinra.
Kunzel was quiet for a minute before he said,
If it was just about leaving, you'd already be gone. If he's not in on it, then how exactly does Sephiroth tie into all this? Oh, well...
Zack hedged.
Sephiroth's helped me with a few things, but he doesn't know what Cloud and I are doing.
Kunzel sank down to sit on the ground before them.
Well, this sounds like a story worth listening to. Come on, Zack. You've been holding out on me all this time. Why not get it all off your chest?
He grinned good-naturedly up at them, then hooked a thumb under his helmet to remove it. Shaking out his hair, he sighed as he tossed it negligently aside.
That's better. All right, I'm all ears. What do I need to know to be in on... What are you even calling this? Operation Save the World, Get the Happy Ending,
Zack said, though his tone was a little blank, as if he were replying in rote.
You took your helmet off. Because that's the important thing you focus on, Zack.
Kunzel said with a sigh.
You're blonde. So I am. So am I. But who's acting more like one?
Cloud muttered, not sure exactly why it was so shocking. Sure, he'd never seen Kunzel without his helmet on. But what had Zack expected? Marlboro tentacles growing out of his head? Zack shoved at Cloud's shoulder.
Shut it. This is the first time I've ever seen him with his helmet off. This is monumentous. I'd say a conspiracy against the company you work for. The most powerful company in the world, in fact, is a little more momentous.
Kunzel countered.
That's become pretty normal, actually.
Kunzel shook his head.
How long has this been going on? I get that everything went weird when you fell into that Mako pool,
he said, nodding at Cloud.
But this is too big for just that. You're all of, what, 15? What's driving you? I wonder if you're a Wutai supporter, but that doesn't seem to gel.
Cloud leaned back into his hands, staring consideringly down at Kunzel. He knew Kunzel liked to be in the know on everything important. It must have bothered him endlessly to know that there was something going on with Cloud, and by extension Zack. He'd have no real idea what it was. and he kept his counsel until he found out they were in danger, where he then came to let them know. Zach's faith in him wasn't misplaced, and really, they needed someone like Kunzel, someone with a cooler head and an outside perspective to help them out. Someone that the Turks wouldn't be looking at as closely as they watched the two of them. Zach upheld him as a dear, trustworthy friend. How many of Zach's friendships had fallen to the side when he decided to stick by Cloud's side? The least he could do was to return some of that loyalty.
Actually,
he said slowly,
I'm 23. Or 4. I think it might have technically had a birthday in there somewhere. If you're counting days.
He was aware of Kunzel's dumbstruck expression and added,
I'm not on any side. I just want those I care about to be safe and happy.
Zach rolled his eyes, then went stock still, at the same time as Kunzel said,
What?
Zach yelped out a,
Cloud?
The two of them were staring at him, as if he'd grown a second head. Cloud raised an eyebrow at Zach's shock.
We were going to tell him, right? Yeah, but...
Zach blinked and shook himself visibly.
Don't tell me I missed your birthday. I thought I had time.
The silence stretched as Cloud tried to find something, anything to say to that.
It's in August.
It was the only thing his dumbstruck mind could come up with.
Yeah.
Kunzel broke in, voice dry as the wastes. His head swiveled back and forth between the two of them.
I can see what you're working with here. That you definitely need me. Hey!
Zach yelped, but Kunzel ignored it as he shifted forward.
All right, fill me in. You've got my attention at least.
Still bemused by Zach's tangent, Cloud shook himself and refocused. It was still a gamble to bring Kunzel in like this. Cloud's improbable arrival aside, would Kunzel believe in a world where Sephiroth, the beloved war hero, went mad and tried to destroy it?
How much do you know about Mako?
He asked slowly. He had to remind himself again that most people had never heard of the live stream at this point. Mako was as close as any of them understood it.
About as much as they teach us in basic, and a bit more besides. I like to do some light reading.
Cloud hummed at that.
Then, have you heard of the live stream? In passing, I may have spent some time in Cosmo Canyon.
That was surprising, but maybe not, considering it was Kunzel.
Livestream, in one sense, is the memory of the planet,
Cloud said with a nod. He let his eyes go unfocused as he thought back to his own times in Cosmo Canyon, listening to the wisdom of Nanaki's grandfather and the knowledge of the town. Of course, Livestream was much more than that, but right now that was the important part.
I fell into the Livestream when I was, and when I came out, I was with Zach. When?
Kunzel echoed blankly.
Yes,
Cloud agreed.
When? The reason everyone here thinks I'm off is because I don't know what has happened, could happen.
He waved one hand in frustration, unable to articulate the complexity of it.
I just want to make sure
that the people he cares about don't die. Zach, Aerith, even Tifa and the rest. Well, not his. He still wanted them to have a long, safe life. And now he also wanted a future for Sephiroth. It still made him uncomfortable to think about, a conflicting feeling in his stomach that it was wrong and right. He had come to know Sephiroth, and the reserved, powerful, lonely man deserved something outside of the cold walls of Shinra as much, if not more, than everyone else did. Zack may have been the reason for Cloud to give him a chance, but now Cloud was ready to reach out a helping hand, as so many had for him. Kunzel squinted at him thoughtfully, brow furrowed.
So what? You've got some sort of precognition?
Cloud spluttered out a laugh.
No, hardly. I just remember my previous life, I guess you would call it. And you believe this crazy story?
Kunzel asked bluntly, looking at Zack.
Yeah, I do.
Zack replied immediately.
Even now, I don't know if I'll wake up tomorrow to find out Cloud's been having some sort of Mako delirium and I've just been humouring him.
He glanced at Cloud then.
But I'd rather take that chance than have to hand him over to someone like Hojo, or have to put a sword through him myself. You mean try?
Cloud interjected, not offended.
And I mean, hey, time material exists, right?
Zack carried on, ignoring the comment. He looked off into the sky again, though. Cloud could see that he was watching him from the corner of his eyes.
And Jill once told me that no story isn't worth hearing. So I listened, and I decided to believe in you. I took a chance, and so far I haven't regretted it.
Sometimes I question it too, Cloud said softly in response.
That this isn't just some final vision as I die, or that I'm not still lost to the Mako dreams.
But he shook his head as if to banish such thoughts. It's too real. It changes too much. In Mako dreams, nothing changes. You repeat over and over. So every time there's something different, something new, I know it's real. There had never been any hesitation in Zack's support of him. At first, Cloud had questioned it, since it was Zack. Zack, who was everybody's friend, who never failed to reach out a helping hand. But after a while, Cloud had learned his friend was more than that. Zack hid a part of himself as surely as Sephiroth did. Only he was outgoing, friendly, and inviting. There was a violent, dark part of Zack that Cloud only heard about through rumor and speculation, and occasionally Zack himself. How he had destroyed an entire fortress of enemy soldiers. How it had been Zack who had been sent out against Angeal and Genesis. Cloud knew Zack was used to doing what was necessary. Shinra took advantage of that loyalty, which in turn had caused Zack so much grief. But because of it, Zack was resisting, was forming his own opinions on what mattered to him, what he would die for. Cloud would never let it come to that. Zack had taken a risk, bet his life on the words of his teacher and Cloud's fantastic story, and Cloud would see to it that it paid off. Kunzel cleared his throat, and Cloud's gaze snapped to him.
Oh, don't let me interrupt this fascinating conversation,
Kunzel said.
Go on, by all means.
Cloud ducked his chin behind his scarf, feeling his cheeks heat up. He had forgotten for a moment Kunzel was even there.
Sorry, man,
Zack said, sounding utterly unapologetic. Kunzel sighed, rubbing at the bridge of his nose.
How do you always get caught up in so much insanity? I just know the right people.
Kunzel turned back to Cloud and gave him a wry smile.
Don't take this the wrong way, but I'm going to do some research of my own on all of that.
He waved vaguely to indicate their conversation. Cloud nodded, lifting his chin as his embarrassment faded.
But let's say I'm on board 100%. What's the plan? You said your goal is to keep people important to you safe, but there's got to be more to that. What and who are you keeping safe from?
Cloud took a deep breath.
Sephiroth.
A second later, his breath was forced out of him as Zack elbowed him in the side. Kunzel reared back in surprise.
All right. I can see how he would be a problem. So,
his expression went completely flat.
You're plotting against Sephiroth.
Not exactly, Cloud hedged, rubbing his side and shooting Zack an irritated look.
It's more that we're trying to save him. Cloud made that sound worse than it is. It's a work in progress.
Zack rolled the water bottle in his hands.
If we can get him to pull away from Shinra, that changes the game big time.
Kunzel gave a low whistle.
He didn't even take off when Genesis and Angeal did. You really think you can get him to? I don't think he was given the chance to.
Zack said quietly.
We can't take the chance either, of him not leaving.
Cloud added.
Shinra is the birthplace of monsters. If he stays, if he believes what they want him to, he'll do worse than desert Shinra. Earlier, when you said, go the way of Genesis,
Kunzel said slowly, keen gaze switching between Cloud and Zack.
You mean more than just deserting, don't you? It has to do with what wasn't said about why they left. You know how we're enhanced?
When Kunzel nodded, Zack continued.
Those three were enhanced in a different way. From the time that they were very young. Shinra had their claws in them their entire lives. They left because of that. And you see the damage that Genesis did over it. We're worried what Sephiroth will do if he takes it the wrong way. I'm sure he knows some of it already, but I don't think he's aware of the whole of it yet.
Cloud leaned forward, catching Kunzel's eye.
If Sephiroth were to turn against the world, who could stop him? You could,
Kunzel said, meeting Cloud's stare challengingly. Cloud sat back slowly and nodded.
I could.
Physically, yes, but after coming to know Sephiroth as more than an enemy, it would hurt to have to fight him again.
Now I have more questions than answers. Thanks.
Zack gave a sheepish bark of laughter.
You get used to it. I take it you don't think Sephiroth will listen if you tell him all of this.
Cloud let his gaze drop to his lap, clenching his hands together.
Sephiroth doesn't trust anyone.
It was such a fragile thing, and the small amount that he and Zack have been able to gain wouldn't hold up against the harsh truth.
Not after Angeal and Genesis. He'd kill us for trying,
he said lightly, trying to inject some levity. It fell flat, because there really wasn't anything funny about it all.
You don't think he'd be interested in the information you have?
He won't believe it without proof. Kunzel nodded, expression thoughtful.
So, the question is, where do you get proof he'll believe?
We'll have a chance in Nibelheim, Cloud said softly, when they send him, and hopefully us. Kunzel gave him a skeptical look.
And you're certain they will?
Hojo will make sure of it.
Now we've come to the science department's stake in this,
Kunzel said dryly.
I knew we wouldn't get through this without them getting involved, but I had hoped for a little while there.
Cloud shoved himself to his feet, taking a few restless paces away as he crossed his arms. He didn't bother turning around as he said,
There's something that Hojo wants to happen. There's a being called Genova.
Ah, Kunzel muttered.
That.
No, Cloud said. I mean more than the dead cells they use on soldiers.
No, I know,
Kunzel said, raising his hands when Cloud rounded on him in surprise.
The Genova project caused a schism in the science department 20 years ago. It wasn't pretty.
Blinking in dumbfounded amazement, Cloud narrowed his eyes.
Well, what do you know about it then?
Kunzel shrugged.
I know that it was something that both Hojo and Hollander were working on, as well as Gast. That it was a contest between Hojo and Hollander to see who'd get to be the head of the science department, to make a new super soldier who was like the ancients, and could lead the way to greatness and the motherlode of all Mako. What the hell, Kunzel?
Zack's voice broke through Cloud's amazement. He sounded just as flabbergasted as Cloud felt.
I know that Sephiroth is the reason Hojo won, and Genesis and Angeal are the reason Hollander lost.
Kunzel looked smugly satisfied at the open disbelief and grinned.
Seems like you weren't as far ahead of me as you thought. Anyway, Genova?
Cloud shook his head, letting the tension leak out of his shoulders.
Do I need to tell you what Genova is? Or do you know that too?
He said, grinning faintly. Trust Kunzel to turn the discussion on its head so thoroughly.
All the official information I could find call it an ancient.
It's not, Cloud said sharply, sour mood returning. That's... He cut himself off, taking a deep breath to calm down the spike of irritation.
Genova came to this planet. It was the ancients that sealed it away. I'm guessing that Hojo has further plans for Sephiroth and Genova then.
What he wants is to test the reunion theory, Cloud said.
Nibelheim is where he sets it up. It's isolated, so it's the best place to trap Sephiroth into facing it.
It was also isolated from Shinra's influence. They needed to take that opportunity to make their move and get Sephiroth to leave. The only uncertainty in the equation was Genova. Once they took care of Genova, they'd have that chance. He knew that the alien had been a catalyst to Sephiroth's madness, but he wasn't certain by how much. A lot of it had come from the false research Hojo had planted in the library for Sephiroth to find. Yet in the end, Sephiroth had gone when his mother had called. Later, she became a means to his end. So where did her influence start? Where did it stop? If he could be sure where she was at the moment, he might even consider breaking off from Shinra to take care of it now. But he hadn't felt her influence since that time months ago with Sephiroth. Had it been because she was currently in Shinra Tower, in one of Hojo's labs? Or had her influence reached all the way from Nibelheim? Without knowing where she was, they couldn't risk abandoning things to deal with her first. She was still active. That much he did know. The faint buzzing in the back of his head, even now, quiet and barely there, indicated that his link to Sephiroth was still there. While she was around, Sephiroth would be able to influence Cloud, even if he hadn't realized it yet.
Reunion theory is actually a new one for me. Amazing,
Zack muttered.
The long and the short of it is that Cloud has some sort of telepathic connection to Sephiroth, because he's tied up in all of that too.
Kunzel gave Zack a blank look, before rounding on Cloud with an "Are you serious?" expression. Cloud gave an uncomfortable shrug as he avoided his gaze.
The pieces of Genova want to come back together. Hojo thinks Sephiroth can be the catalyst to start the reunion.
Right, Kunzel said, still sounding more than a little incredulous.
This is one of those things from the future? How does that work, considering we're talking on a genetic level here? It just does,
Cloud said sullenly. He honestly had no idea, but he had to suffer the consequences regardless.
And that's why you're so certain when it comes to Sephiroth,
Kunzel said agreeably.
Got it. You're not believing a word of this, are you?
Zack accused.
Give me time to process and validate some things first.
Cloud frowned consideringly at Kunzel, thinking back on what had started this conversation in the first place.
You said the Turks were investigating me? How did you find out?
Not that he was surprised by it. Either the Turks investigating him or Kunzel's knowledge of it. If nothing else, his first real meeting with Reno would have been enough to pique their curiosity, let alone how often his paths crossed Sephiroth's.
They aren't just investigating,
Kunzel said, looking immediately more comfortable at the shift in the conversation.
They're having secret meetings. Meetings that include kicking everyone out of the cafeteria, and then forgetting to check the kitchens a second time.
He ran his hands over his face, then passed it through his hair.
I overheard them about a week ago. You two were out on that assignment about Calm.
Which Turks? Cloud asked. It was hard to remember sometimes that there were more than just the four of them running around. Dutifully, Kunzel said.
I recognized Renaud saying rude, Cisne, and shotgun. They mentioned bringing in another, though.
Zack immediately sat up straight, his expression turning a slightly grim pallor.
That's
He looked over at Cloud.
not good. I thought you were friends with a couple of them.
Kunzel asked, waving a hand at Zack.
You're not friends with Turks.
Cloud couldn't help grumble out.
Just temporary allies.
He couldn't bring himself to trust them to do more than be pests, in his experience. Maybe somewhat useful pests, but annoying all the same. You should never forget how dangerous a Turk can be.
They've got their own agenda,
Zack said. He finally set the crumpled water bottle down by one of his boots and propped his chin on his hands.
They've been watching me for a while now. I heard.
Kunzel said dryly.
You two really don't do things by halves, do you? They were analysing everything from the way Cloud here reacted to his old squads to how potent the Mako he fell in was.
Cloud rocked back on his heels, eyes narrowing.
They know how strong it was?
He remembered the burning pain, the loss of reason, but hadn't been completely sure if it was from the Mako he fell into from his time, or the stuff he'd come out of. It hadn't been bad enough for him to be lost to his mind again, so he'd assumed it was somewhat diluted himself.
It was pure,
Kunzel said.
You ought to be a vegetable, or dead, or both.
Zack groaned and put his face in his hands.
Damn Turks,
Cloud muttered, running a hand over his face tiredly. They never made things easy. He flapped a hand at Kunzel.
Obviously, I'm not. They also know you're having memory problems,
Kunzel added with an apologetic shrug. Cloud looked sour.
Yeah, Sang was in Icicle. That makes sense,
Kunzel said.
But how long have you been having them? With the way you take it in stride, I'd guess a long time. It's not just the Mako, is it?
That's complicated. Cloud hedged. Zack groaned beside him, and Kunzel gave him a blind stare.
I'm sure it is,
he drawled.
Why haven't you seen one of the soldier program's doctors about it? They're experts in Mako effects. Maybe they could help.
Taking a deep breath, Cloud let it out slowly, trying to curb the flare of anger. It wasn't Kunzel's fault he didn't know.
No.
Kunzel held his hands up in a placating gesture.
Just covering all the bases.
Running a hand through his hair, Cloud waved that off. It's frustrating not remembering, but it's been a long time. To be honest, I don't remember a lot about now. He'd had years to come to terms with his missing memories. It was only now that he was in the middle of the empty spaces in his mind that it was quite so obvious. But they made it this far without too much suspicion on them. At least, until now, it seemed.
So, if I asked you what you did for your birthday last year, you wouldn't have a clue. Funny,
Cloud griped.
I try,
Kunzel said dryly. Clapping his hands, he rubbed them together and gave them both a grin.
Lucky for you two, I think the fact that you have no obvious motive is throwing them off. They're trying to figure out if you're in cahoots with Avalanche or some other group. They're trying to piece this together like a logical puzzle, when it's a completely insane one. That's one thing going for us, at least,
Zack mused.
I doubt they'd ever really get why we're doing it. It's not on the usual list of reasons to terrorize the company.
Well, Cloud had terrorized Shinra over the planet once, and he wasn't against that goal either. But for now, their priorities lay in the people. There would be time enough to protect the planet, and if not, it was quite capable of protecting itself. With a groan, Zack stretched until his spine popped.
We'll just have to be more careful from here on out. I'll keep my eyes and ears open for you,
Kunzel said quietly.
Keep me in the loop if you can.
Zach's face was a picture of earnest gratitude as he said,
I appreciate it, man. Always have, you know that. Well?
Kunzel rubbed the back of his head before shrugging.
It was that or leave the company, and I'm not quite ready to be out of the loop just yet. Besides, I couldn't just leave you here to flounder around on your own. You need all the help you can get.
Kunzel stood up, dusting dirt off his pants. Zach stepped into Kunzel's personal space and threw an arm around his shoulder in what was more of a headlock than anything else. Cloud rolled his eyes and smirked at Kunzel's snapped,
Zach, off! I love you, man. Seriously. Cloud, get him off.
Standing up as well, Cloud shook his head and allowed a chuckle.
It gets worse the more you struggle. Just give in.
He watched the second struggle for a few more seconds, aware Zach was clinging now just for fun, and added,
Besides, I don't want to get sucked in.
Zach finally released Kunzel and rocked back on his heels. His spirits were obviously high, in spite of the serious conversation they'd just had. His friendship with Kunzel was a bit deeper than any of the other soldiers, so it must have been a relief that they had been able to count on him. Kunzel waved at Zach.
Take him home and make sure he gets a bath. Sir.
Cloud replied dryly, adding in a mock salute. Zach immediately broke down laughing, and Kunzel sent him a concerned look. Kunzel leaned down and scooped up his helmet. He thrust one hand out at Cloud, which Cloud grasped firmly.
Glad to be working with you guys officially. But no, seriously,
Zach said, bulldozing in between them. He slung an arm over each of their shoulders.
You're blonde. Why are all my best buds fair-haired? Wait, that pun was an accident.
Rolling his eyes, Cloud elbowed Zach in the side. He exchanged a glance with Kunzel. Then as one, they shrugged Zach's arms off and turned to lead the field.
Guys?
Zach called after them. When they didn't stop, Cloud heard Zach's heavier footsteps ambling after them.
Guys!
They reached the courtyard ahead of Zach, where Kunzel lifted his hand in a wave.
I'll leave you to deal with him. I've got night shift tonight, so I need to get my gear.
Kunzel said. As he left, he called over his shoulder.
Nice talking to you.
Cloud huffed a quiet laugh, turning as Zach came up next to him. He thumped Zach on the chest, shoving him in the direction of the apartments.
I'll pick up supper. Go shower, Zach. Kunzel was right. I want something spicy, and make sure you actually get yourself something, or I'll make you eat some of mine. Yeah,
Cloud said, waving Zach off. He hadn't missed a meal yet, thanks to Zach's ever-vigilant Mother Henning. It wasn't an idle threat either. Zach liked his food hot, and Cloud wasn't much a fan of having a hole burnt in his tongue. Zach trotted off dutifully, and Cloud turned down another street to head for the Gongaga-style restaurant Zach favored. Ordering the food took no time at all, and Cloud made one more step before he too headed back home. A bottle of white wine under one arm. It seemed like a good night for a drink, and this one had a nice taste to it that went well with spicy food. Sometimes Cloud liked the taste of alcohol, in memory of his Tifa, if nothing else. What he wasn't expecting as he opened the door was to be met with a widely grinning, shirtless Zach blocking his way. Cloud stared at the bare, slightly damp chest right in front of him for a second too long before he managed to jerk his gaze up to Zach's face. He just hoped he'd managed to keep the flush off his face. Looked like Zach was done with his shower. Why does he have to walk around half naked?
That smells good. Hand it over.
Zach held his hand out, wriggling his fingers in demand.
Yeah,
Cloud said absently, before he started and remembered to shove the food containers into Zach's arms as requested. It was going to be one of those nights, he could tell. As Zack examined what Cloud had brought, he said,
"You know, we should head up to the roof and eat out there. It's stuffy in here, and it was a nice night out."
Zack sounded almost wistful. That sounded nice, and Zack would certainly put on a shirt rather than brave the cool night air. Or not. As he pushed Cloud back out the door and closed it behind them, Cloud closed his eyes in quiet despair, his grip tightening convulsively on the bottle he still held, before he shook himself and followed Zack up the stairs with steps that dragged only slightly. He steeled himself to push the fluttering in his stomach out of his mind as he crested the last stair, which didn't help at all as he froze mid-step and stared at Zack lounging comfortably on the edge of the roof, long limbs draped everywhere. Zack looked up from where he was already digging into one of the steaming containers and waved him over. Cloud shook himself out of his stupor to finish crossing the distance and took a seat a few feet away. Zack reached out and wrapped his hands around Cloud's ankle to haul him closer, causing him to half sprawl on the ground.
"Come here. It's not a bad view, really."
He shoved the container he wasn't currently eating at Cloud, which he had to fumble to keep it from spilling on his chest, and kept his hold on the wine bottle. With a quiet grumble at the rough handling, though really he should have expected it by now, Cloud sat up and leaned against the edge's wall next to Zack. He could feel the warmth radiating off Zack's side and popped open his food to distract his traitorous thoughts. Zack drew up one leg and rested his arm on it.
"You know,"
he said, gazing towards the glowing sky,
"it's nights like these that I really miss Gongaga. I was always out in the jungle to all hours. I think I gave my parents every grey hair they had."
"I met them once," Cloud admitted, remembering the deep worry lines and kind smiles. He had never been able to return to Gongaga to face them. Maybe he could have, if he'd stayed, but that chance had passed.
"Oh, yeah? How were they?"
Cloud looked away, knowing what Zack was really getting at.
"Your mother worried why her son hadn't contacted them in so long. Complained that he was being too busy being a hotshot soldier to remember to write home. I don't know if they knew and were pretending, or—"
Cloud hadn't known at the time who it was the Fairs were missing so acutely, but Aerith had known. Tifa had known. Neither had been able to admit it then either. Zack ran a hand through his hair, looking contemplative. His mouth was quirked in a small smile.
I've been bad about that."
Turning back to him, Cloud said quietly,
"You have the chance now, though." "I miss them,"
Zack admitted.
"I don't regret leaving to follow my dream, but—"
He looked down at his food, toying with a corner of the container.
"I haven't really felt this homesick since I first left."
With a shake of his head, Cloud gave in to the urge to lean into Zack's side, hoping to provide some comfort.
"They'll welcome you home whenever you go. I'd like to meet them for real this time, too. When we get the chance, we'll visit,"
Zack said firmly.
"And hey, maybe we can even take Aerith sometime. She'll enjoy it."
Cloud agreed. Zack went back to eating, and Cloud silently followed his example. He didn't, however, move away from Zack's side. The lull continued for a short while before Zack once more broke the quiet.
"You once asked me what it felt like to be in Soldier."
The comment was unexpected, and Cloud stiffened. He didn't remember ever asking Zack that. Swallowing his mouthful, he asked,
"What?" "You probably don't remember it. It was before."
He grinned down at him.
"Back before Medill. before you got here. I told you that you'd just have to find out for yourself.
Blinking, Cloud shook his head with a frown.
It doesn't matter now. I know what Soldier is like. It was your dream, wasn't it, to be in Soldier?
Cloud looked away, pushing his food to one side and drawing his knees up.
Yeah, once. And I failed.
Zach's hand found Cloud's shoulder and gave it a squeeze.
No way! It doesn't matter if you never got in officially. You've got soldier pride, and that's what counts.
The words were an eerie echo of the other Zach, and Cloud shied away from them similarly. He knew what they meant, but they didn't understand Cloud's promise to Tifa, his promise to himself, and how he'd failed at both, even if later he'd made something out of himself. It wasn't the dream he'd started out for, that was centered around the elusive title.
It doesn't matter.
How could he make Zach understand? Zach, who succeeded in his dreams, even if they turned out rotten. Cloud hadn't been suitable, had been forced to return home and hide in shame. And those were failures he'd never forget, no matter how strong he was now.
Does it?
Zach seemed genuinely curious, watching him with an open expression. Cloud flexed his hands, feeling the leather of his gloves creak against the movement.
If it was just that, I'd agree with you. But after I borrowed the other Zach's memories,
Stole them, actually.
I honestly thought I'd been a soldier, that I'd fulfilled all of those promises. It was part of the false me. If I were to call myself a soldier again, it wouldn't feel like me.
The silence after Cloud's words stretched, and he plucked nervously at his pant leg. He wasn't sure why, but it was important that Zach understand. Maybe because soldier meant something special to Zach as well, just not in the same way it did to Cloud. For Zach, soldier was more metaphorical. It was a state of being. It was being honorable and proud and upholding something, whereas for Cloud it was a title, strength, something he'd stolen and didn't deserve. That wasn't his. It was a symbol of his failure.
It's probably for the best,
Zach said, his mouth twisted into a grim smile.
Shinra's soldier is not a place anyone should be.
Cloud wilted slightly at Zach's words. He felt bad at Zach's disillusionment of what he'd held in such high regard. But as he said, maybe it was for the best.
Who knows what it would change,
he said.
And I still don't want the title anyway. I doubt we'll be able to hold them off forever. We don't need forever. We just need long enough.
Shifting his legs back down and crossing them, Cloud fumbled at his side and nearly knocked over the forgotten bottle of wine. He rescued it before it could tip over, then realized he'd not thought to get a bottle opener. To be fair, he'd been distracted. Remembering a trick Tifa had shown him, he carefully held his hand above the top of the cork, then let a lick of power sink into the materia in his bracer. It was just a tiny pinpoint, but the pull of the gravity spell was enough to have the cork popped out in seconds. Cloud quickly cut off the spell as the cork hit his palm, then held the bottle out to Zach. There was no need for glasses. Zach accepted the bottle and took a swig from it before handing it back.
That,
he said,
was cool. Tifa showed it to me. She learned it from the owner of the bar who was helping Avalanche at the time.
Cloud was reminded again of the fact that Zach had named that bar.
I think it's universal for any bartender to know, just in case. That's right!
Zach smacked his fist into his palm. Cloud raised an eyebrow, startled by the outburst.
I was going to talk to you about Avalanche.
His expression shifted into something a little more serious again.
The Avalanche you were with. They weren't like the ones that are active now, were they?
Cloud made a rude little sound in the back of his throat.
No,
he said darkly. It still soured him that Avalanche had come from something so unpleasant.
Nothing like it.
He frowned absently, turning the wine bottle in his hands.
It was just a handful of people trying to protect the planet the only way they knew how. Nothing on the scale of this group. I don't know much about Avalanche right now. That's mostly the Turks' territory. But I do know what I saw up north.
Zack clenched his teeth, a muscle jumping in his jaw.
What they did to Asai and Sebastian.
Narrowing his eyes, Cloud looked over at Zack. He remembered that time Zack had come back from his mission, devastated over the state of his two friends. At the time, Cloud hadn't felt right digging for information. Not only was Zack upset, but then there'd been their own, well, fight was too strong a word for it. Still, even then, he'd been somewhat aware that Avalanche had been the cause of it. The more he learned about the group of this time period, the more he disliked what he heard.
What happened to them?
He prompted gently. At least he could be here to listen to what Zack couldn't share with anyone else.
You remember that Avalanche soldier you fought in high school?
Zack said, picking at his pant leg. Cloud nodded sardonically. How could he forget?
They turned them into one of them. Ravens. That's what I heard them called once. I don't really know how it works, or what they are exactly. They're like soldiers, I guess, but not. They're not entirely human anymore.
He shook his head, wild mane of hair going every which way with the force of it.
It turned their armor all black and they just laughed and attacked us.
Mental games. Cloud shuddered, all too familiar with the symptoms. He reached out a hand and shoved the wine bottle at Zack's face. Maybe the alcohol didn't affect them, but the motions of drinking still soothed the nerves. A different sort of mental game, in fact. Zack took the hint and tilted the bottle up, taking a long draught of it. When he finished, Cloud took the bottle for a drink of his own. This avalanche were too much like the company they were opposing, in his opinion. Not that he and his friends had always been justified in their actions, but it was nothing as reprehensible as turning people into weapons against their will. His lips curled in disgust. That was Hojo and his ilk's territory.
I didn't think you'd be with a group that was, well, like that. You don't strike me as the type. I mean, us working for Shinra aside.
Zack blew out a long breath, shoulders slouching, as if under the weight of the memories he'd dredged up.
I just want you to know how bad Avalanche is. I'm starting to see that.
Cloud agreed darkly. He and his ragtag band of friends had grown beyond their initial hatred. Once things had become larger than the Shinra company alone, they'd come out the better for it, still using the Avalanche name in the memory of their starting point. Looking at Zack out of the corner of his eye, he noted the tight frown and the dark shadows behind his eyes, and in an attempt to shake him out of his dour mood, nudged his leg.
I should tell you about the time I helped blow up a reactor.
Zack barked out a laugh, the tension leaking slowly from his shoulders.
Don't say that out loud, man!
He paused a second, a slow grin spreading on his face.
Guess that might come in handy eventually, huh?
He slouched down lower until his head came to rest on Cloud's thigh. It felt like an electric shock was working its way up Cloud's spine, pulling him sharply to attention. Suppressing the urge to shiver, he tried to keep his breathing even. The last time Zack pulled this on him, it hadn't been as nerve-wracking. It completely derailed his train of thought as he tried to figure out what to do with his hands.
Thanks,
Zack murmured.
I needed the laugh.
Finally, Cloud allowed his hand to tangle in Zack's hair. He marveled at how different the same motions could be before shoving those feelings back down.
Sounded like it,
Cloud said.
I think we need to get you down to see Aerith. I'm not so good at this making you feel better thing. It's worked well so far,
Zack said, though a silly grin had spread across his face at the mention of Aerith.
You know, she'll still wonder where you are if you don't come too. Who do you think is going to make sure you get there without any distractions?
He chided. Zack pushed himself up and gave Cloud a playful shove before holding out his hand.
Give me the bottle. It stuff's pretty good. Not like that cacti kicker thing. I was worried about your ability to taste.
Cloud considered that for a moment.
It tasted like licking a pear out of a freezer.
He considered longer.
Then eating a thunderspell.
Zack laughed hard and with his whole body before dropping back down after he'd taken the swig.
You really are something else.
Chuckling, Cloud shrugged again.
I'm just me. Wouldn't have you any other way, buddy.
Flash returning, Cloud ducked his chin into his scarf to hide his pleased grin. Never change, Zack. Cissnei found that the dark halls posed little problem for her these days. She'd long since grown used to the Shinra building's layout, and there was enough low illumination from the runner lights to let her see. She ghosted along, sticking close to the wall. Already she could hear her comrades' voices up ahead, leaking out through the only door that remained open. Briefly, she contemplated passing up the door to do a sweep of the floor herself, to make sure that all the regular employees had cleared out for the night. However, she was pushing up against the assigned meeting time as it was. She trusted that her co-workers had already covered the routine check. Plus, she didn't want to hear it from Reno if she was late. Admittedly, there was a part of her that was curious. It wasn't normal that they had these little meetings so close together. Barely a week had passed since the last, which had heralded more questions than answers. The entire affair left Cissnei with a bad taste in her mouth, likely due, in part, to the soft spot she had for Zack. There was just something about him, about his personality, that made him far too likable. So often she found her feelings toward him clashing abruptly with her loyalty to the company and the Turks. It made it all too easy to imagine Zack and Cloud were really up to something. They both had some sort of charisma, though Zack's was louder and broader, and so much more apparent. Cloud's was quiet, a strange strength that drew people to him. Maybe even people like Sephiroth. Inside the room, Reno stood with his back towards the door. Cissnei leaned against the frame and crossed her arms over her breasts.
If she's gonna be a no-show,
Reno drawled,
we should get this going. I ain't gonna cater to her like some kind of princess.
Rude cleared his throat loudly, gesticulating at Reno in a way that Cissnei supposed was to warn him of her presence.
Good evening, Shuriken,
Katana murmured, pushing his glasses up so they caught the light. This was the first meeting he was sitting in on, and she wondered if anyone had a chance to fill him in on exactly what they were here for. He was too professional to let it show either way, something she respected. Evening, Cissnei replied softly. She shoved her way from the door and closed it behind her as she stepped further into the room. Your timing's off a little, Reno. Reno gave her a sharp smirk as he glanced over his shoulder.
You think? Seemed perfect to me.
Cissnei flicked her fingers to him dismissively and moved over to take the seat left open between Katana and Shotgun. The room was one of the many reading rooms scattered about the business floors of Shinra Tower. Despite the normal work hours, they were rarely empty. Each seat had a terminal before it, a larger screen taking up the wall in front of the table with the Shinra logo revolving on it. Cisne clasped her hands upon the tabletop. "Why are we here, sir?" she asked, looking across at Tseng expectantly.
"Oh, sure. Now she's here, she tries to hurry us all along,"
Renaud complained, before flopping into the chair next to Rude and immediately kicking his feet up onto the table.
There was an unscheduled emergency stop on one of the executive elevators, just before Strife's promotion meeting,
Tseng said, pressing his palms flat to the tabletop to silence further crosstalk.
We got the video feed from the elevators. No audio, though,
Renaud pointed out.
I am aware, Renaud,
Tseng said.
I've managed to make out part of the conversation, though the angle makes it difficult to accurately gauge what's being discussed. However, I believe Katana to be quite skilled in lip reading.
Beside her, Katana adjusted his glasses and pushed himself to his feet. He headed around the table to stand close to the large screen and pulled out a pad of paper and a pen from his pocket.
If you would be so kind.
Shotgun was the closest to the remote and quickly switched to a paused image of the executive elevator car, Zack and Cloud in it. The video began to play, and Katana leaned in close to observe them. Cisne considered the pair, taking in Zack's nervous stance and the way Cloud immediately began to tense up. She'd observed the pair long enough now that their body language had become familiar. Katana gave a soft
Ah, here,
he said, as Zack in the video reached out to press the emergency stop button.
There's not much I can do about Fair. His back's to the camera. Could that be on purpose?
Shotgun asked, pausing the video.
It's possible,
Tseng said, steepling his fingers before his face.
We have further feed from the trip back down, where Strife takes up a similar position. You really think they're that sneaky?
Renaud drawled, foot jiggling absently.
I mean, Fair's got all the subtlety of a behemoth, and Strife's not that far behind.
Tseng gave a low chuckle.
I am aware, but that doesn't mean they're stupid. It's entirely possible that... No, we must assume that they were aware of Shinra's security measures to some degree. Please,
Katana said, gesturing to Shotgun, if you would. She nodded and unpaused the video. He watched it closely as it played through, absently mouthing words to himself, though he didn't repeat them aloud. After Zack and Cloud had exited the elevator for the final time, he made a swirling motion at Shotgun to play it again. This time, he began taking down notes as they went, a hand scribbling across the paper quickly. Cisne turned her attention to the screen as the scene played over again. She narrowed her eyes. Can we enhance the reflection in the glass? She asked. Renaud gave a derisive laugh.
Not with the crap quality of those cameras. The execs don't like being spied on, so they haven't approved any budget to get them upgraded. Grainy and blurry is the best you get.
Worth a try, Shotgun murmured beside her, and Cisne gave a faint smile.
One half of the conversation it is then, though from what I've seen, I doubt we're getting much.
Thoughtfully, Cisne said, I noticed that while Zack's nervous at the start, by the time they arrive the first time, they're both tense. There was a quiet rumble from Rude.
Maybe he knew. What, about the promotion?
Renaud clarified.
It's probable,
Katana said, not pausing in his work.
One of Strife's lines is definitely about what they're doing right now. I wouldn't be surprised if that was part of their conversation. How'd that go, anyway?
Renaud asked, lolling his head. His cheek bumped into his shoulder as he directed his attention towards Tseng.
Any word on it?
Cisne followed the conversation attentively, her gaze flicking between the screen and her co-workers. Shotgun leaned forward, her ponytail slithering across her shoulder. Her interest obvious. It made Cisne wonder, really, what stake Shotgun had in this. She considered her from the corner of her eye. Shotgun had had the most interaction with Cloud before he'd been brought to their attention. Maybe she would find the time to talk to her about it personally.
He declined.
Tseng's words brought Cisne's attention snapping back over to him. Reno exhaled a quiet,
Huh.
The video ended again, and Katana sat back on his heels, studying what he'd written down. Seemingly satisfied, he nodded and retook his seat at the table.
It's not much to go on, unfortunately. There might be some credit to them positioning themselves on purpose. Strife first, and fair later, are quite vague.
He ripped out the top sheet from his pad and passed it over to Tseng. Reno rocked forward on his chair, his shoes hitting the floor with an audible slap. He leaned over to Tseng to read over his shoulder. Then his brow twitched.
Hear about what? Why, who would what? Talk about what?
He yelled, voice raising with each question.
I'm a little more interested in what Strife says about this third party,
Tseng said, tapping at a line on the page before passing it to Reno.
About undercutting power. It seems clear that this third party factors into their discussion a great deal.
With a huff, Reno settled back in his chair and slid his paper along to Rude, who leaned over it.
Someone with a lot of power or pride?
He griped.
Or both?
Rude added.
And who do we know like that?
Sephiroth, Genesis Rhapsodus before he died, Cisne pointed out.
Several members of Avalanche.
Shotgun drawled.
Any number of soldiers.
She accepted the paper from Rude as he passed it along, and Cisne leaned in closer to get a look as well. They could be discussing training, she said thoughtfully. Zack's been mentoring a large number of soldiers lately.
Yeah, but just before an important meeting?
Reno countered.
You don't need to stop an elevator to discuss that.
Tapping the fingers of one hand on the table, Katana said,
It was a meeting about promoting Strife to soldier.
He leaned over and reached past Cisne to snag the remote and set about replaying the video.
The possibility that they're purposely obfuscating things does make it seem more suspicious. Though, are they?
He tilted his head, smiling dryly.
If they were trying to hide, then they wouldn't have had the conversation in the elevator at all, let alone where one of them could be filmed.
Reno snorted.
This is why we need a fresh pair of eyes. Those two couldn't plan their way out of a wet paper bag.
He jabbed a finger at Katana.
Just wait until you try to wrap your head around the rest of this mess.
Him spending more time surrounded by other soldiers doesn't necessarily bode well either. He could be making a popularity gambit. What with Soldier destabilized after Lazard's disappearance and all. Shotgun shrugged and went on. I mean, look how many of them Genesis got to go with him. Yet neither of them have given any indication of anti-Shinra leanings, Cisne pointed out. She supposed that his turning a blind eye to the spy in the slums could be read as anti-Shinra action, but from what she'd seen, Zack had been ready to take the insurgent out. Only once the child had interfered had he softened his position. Zack has been doing his duty as a first exceptionally well in keeping the men's morale up, despite the losses that Soldier Program has suffered. Zeng hummed quietly.
Perhaps we need to be more active in our observation of Zack, and Cloud as well. We've noted some of the behavioral changes in Cloud, but we haven't looked into that aspect of Zack's recent behavior. Fair is from Kangaga, is he not?
Katana interjected. When Zeng nodded, he continued.
I am as well. If I take a week's leave to return home, I could investigate if he's made any strange contact there.
Zeng gave a sharp nod.
Do it. Cisne, now would be a good time to start compiling a list of those they're close to here in Midgar. Once we have a clear idea of who they associate with, we may be able to figure out who this third party is, as well as if they've made contact with any of the known anti-Shinra cells.
Cisne nodded and slid the paper back across the table to Zeng. Of course, I'll start on it right away. Looking around at them, Zeng met the gaze of each in turn. Cisne noticed a slight tension to his shoulders and at the corners of his eyes. Zack was one of Zeng's friends as well. She wondered if he felt as torn on the issue as she did. That was the problem with having internal affairs like this crop up. Personal involvement became a detriment. All of them, however, were loyal. There was no question there.
I suspect,
Tseng said,
that this investigation will soon become an on-the-record one. Strife turned down the president's offer, and it's unlikely he'll take no for an answer. We should be prepared to present the information we've gathered to the director and to the president. Make it good.
Around her, Cisne could see the many and varied expressions on her co-workers' faces, each of them determined, each of them knowing what was at stake. They likely only had a short time to make the final call on this issue, and they were no closer to understanding what it was they were looking at. It posed a very serious issue. Tseng stood, gathering his papers.
I think that's all for one night.
At the dismissal, Katana relaxed further back into his chair and rewound the feed again.
I'm going to study this a little longer, if you don't mind.
On Cisne's other side, Shotgun stood up. Cisne reached out to touch her arm and attract her attention. "How about we get a drink?" she offered, and Shotgun gave her a quick grin.
Why not? Maybe a hangover will get rid of the headache I have from this.
Laughing quietly, Cisne stood, and together they headed for the door.
Maybe, but I doubt it.